let's talk about lazy loading. Lazy loading is something that I feel like is really underutilized and can be implemented in a fairly straightforward way. We have some hooks that will help with that. But essentially what's happening under the hood is something that is native in many, many browsers. So what we have here is the Third and Grove homepage. As you kind of initially visit and scroll down a little bit, everything looks totally normal until you get to about here. And then this is a little bit weird. This is just a whole bunch of empty space. So this is happening because JavaScript is disabled. If we visit the page again with JavaScript enabled, as it likely will be, this is something to keep in mind if your use case is sensitive to the needs of like an HTML only page. This may not be good for you. But essentially, what we have here is the same experience. I'm going to clear out the network. You'll see why in a second here. As I scroll down, all of these network calls fired off. I'm going to do this again and show you. Yes, all those network calls. We scroll down, we scroll down. Okay, so all of those images were lazy loaded here. That's Gatsby image doing its job. Okay, so we scroll to this section. Oh, so something in this section, I'm acting like it's a mystery. I wrote this. I know what happens. Something in this section, there's a ref attached to this section that triggers the lazy load of all of this. And essentially, we're leveraging intersection observer, which allows you to know what is and is not visible in the browser's viewport to trigger that. So let's get into a little bit of code to see what that looks like. So this is what the page looks like. Normally, essentially, like you can come here, you can scroll like really fast, faster than anybody is going to scroll on your website, and it loads just fine. You give it enough time to kind of do that here, and what's being loaded is not super heavy. It's 1/2 of the page. It's basically everything a little further down than below the fold, but we'll call it just lazy loading what's below the fold. So everything that's loaded initially, people are probably going to see. They're going to scroll down to this. This is just text, and everything that's below that component is what's lazy loaded. So we are using a hook, and I will put a link to this in the description. This is part of a suite of hooks called useVisibility, but one of the hooks. So all of this code here up until line 52 is just setting up the visibility, the intersection observer. So this is a native browser API that we're leveraging in the form of a hook. So we have use is visible. So if something gets on the screen and then off the screen again, we can use that hook for that. Use has been visible. So if we, don't care about this next part, which is kind of important, this threshold is really what we're using in this particular hook. So use has been partly visible. I'm a fan of very descriptive naming conventions. So use has been partly visible means exactly what it says. It means the element that is the Boolean that we get back tells us whether or not the element attached to the ref that we pass to this has been partly visible. And so we're passing a threshold to this, or we're using a 0.1 threshold. Is that right? Yes. Okay. So essentially, we're passing a 0.1 threshold to half page, right? So I created this ref using the useRef hook, and I just attach it to this component, which is this guy here. So once that's attached to that component, this threshold of 0.1, so like when it's basically any part visible in the DOM, I want to go ahead and kick off that lazy loading. I want that to happen because I don't want this janky experience where you're about to view this and then it all loads into place. So that's essentially how this works. Now I have this Boolean, so this is, flipping a bit. It's true or false that I use in this ternary expression here to either render a big kind of height defined empty div, or all of the content that you see when you're viewing the site normally. So these heights are specific to whether or not we're looking at this in a mobile view or a desktop view. I'm a bit nitpicky, and so I spent some time making sure that those numbers were pretty right. This way, as you're scrolling, so let me get out of this view. So as you're scrolling, you'll notice this scroll bar. So all of that new content is loaded because we have this element visible currently. But the scroll bar doesn't get all jacked up and move around and get funky. I hate when sites do that, so I wanted to make sure this didn't. That's something you may want to consider as you're lazy loading content. It's something many libraries will help you implement, but it is one of the harder things because it's hard to be aware in React of exactly how large something is going to render, and many times it's dynamic, and so it depends on whether or not you're in a mobile view or some other view, depending on what your breakpoints are set at. So it's a whole thing, something you'll have to think about. But essentially, this in the initial static site generation. So when Gatsby gets this and is generating the HTML, this will never be true. So it will always render the empty space, which is why when we visited the page at the beginning of this video, there was just nothing there. And unless JavaScript's there to kick in and load the other content, it'll remain blank. So depending on what's there, if there are a lot of DOM elements there, you may be saving or gaining performance based on just a smaller HTML payload. Who knows? But this is definitely a tool that should be in everybody's bag of tricks. And this is one way to implement it. There are more. There are packages out there, React.lazy, which is a native React API for lazy loading components. There are ways of doing this. I think React Loadable is a way of lazy loading and code splitting, I believe, if you incorporate it with Webpack. So you can have the code for the component you're using completely split off so that even the JavaScript doesn't load until you get to a place on the page where you want it to load. So there's lots of possibilities. This is a very simple, straightforward implementation in my mind. Hopefully you found this useful and you're able to take advantage of it and increase the performance of your website.